One of the things that we've hinted at so far in class, but have not talked about in enough depth, is the role of geography and culture. That is, where you are matters just as much as anything else, right? So the topography of a given portion of the world, the regional differences of things like language, daily life and its rhythms, cultural and social expectations. That is, as I've already mentioned to you in previous contexts, no one was a tabula rasa, not you and not early Christians either. That is, as people began to convert to early Christianity, they heard the message through their own knowledge and worldview. And we began to speak about this last week as we thought about the Apocryphon of John and the selections you read from Irenaeus' Against Heresies, but it is worth sort of elaborating a bit more. So I'd like to take a moment to think about the various regions in which early Christianity is said to have emerged. And one of the things we should note is that there were always sort of traditions around particular disciples heading off and planting Christianity in those places. So, for example, we have the regions of Syria and Mesopotamia, right? And this is important. I'm using this map from our textbook because there aren't very many good maps online of both Christianity all the way from the West to all the way to what we consider the East, right? That you often need to realize that though we are primarily talking about the Roman Empire for the spread of early Christianity, Christianity transcended those boundaries almost from its beginnings, right? So Syria and Mesopotamia, parts of this were Roman and parts of this were under Persian imperial control. Cities like Antioch, Damascus, and Edessa were some of the first places, but also the location of Dura Europos, right? That is, it sits off of the Euphrates. This was a very important sort of site for Roman and Persian boundaries, right? That we have extant synagogues and early Christian sort of imagery as well that indicates that this was an military outpost that quickly became Christianized. What's interesting, right, is that Syria and Mesopotamia are often sort of linked with figures like Addai and Thomas and Bartholomew. The other thing we need to note, right, is the predominant language here would have been Aramaic, like Jesus' own, and then ultimately Syriac. There are going to be important figures like Bardaison that we read about in the coming weeks in week 6 who think about how to wed some of the Zoroastrian traditions that were present and predominant in the Persian Empire with the early Christian movement. Perhaps for our purposes this week, the most interesting is a certain Tatian, who seems to have known of the 4 Gospels that would make it into our canon, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But he decided that given the disparities between them, it was far better to write a unified sort of harmonization of these Gospels. This is known as the Diatessaron, or literally through 4, right? That he weds the 4 of them. There were also Christians, as we know, in Greece and Asia Minor, right? It is in Ephesus that John's tomb is said to have been, right? Papias, who I mentioned in the previous video in regards to canon formation and his value, was from this area. Bishops like Ignatius, who we'll read more of next week, as well as correspondence between Roman imperial figures like Pliny and Trajan that we read next week, all come from this region. Likely the Apocryphon of John that we read last week comes from this region, right? That we have this sort of emphasis in this area in particular on sort of Johannine traditions. Christianity also emerged. Oh, and I should just say really quickly before we leave these regions, the common language here is Greek. Christianity also spread rather quickly in Rome and surrounding regions of the Western Mediterranean, right? So we include spreads into what would become modern day Europe, right? All the way to Spain, but also in North Africa, right? In the regions of Carthage. We group these together because the predominant imperial language in this area was Latin, but we know that there were still Punic language use well into the first centuries of Christianity in North Africa. There were various other languages that were predominant, right? Gallic and other sorts of languages that continue to be important. But Rome, as the heart of the empire, was especially important, right? This is where we ultimately get traditions that Peter and Paul sort of end up. as we read other texts about apologetics and martyrdom next week, we'll read things by Justin Martyr, who is also located in Rome. The Shepherd of Hermas, as we've discussed in previous videos, was situated here, as will be important figures like Tertullian, Irenaeus, who we read, and the Muratorian fragment that we're reading for this week. Christianity also began to spread in Alexandria and deeper into Egypt and Nubia and the kingdom of Aksum that would become modern-day Ethiopia partially. Here, it's interesting to note that especially in Alexandria, there had been a large Jewish community, but under Trajan in the early 2nd century, there would be a large anti-Jewish pogrom and many of the Jews would permanently flee Alexandria, but Christianity would remain. There were many philosophical schools situated out of Alexandria, and we will be reading both passages from Clement and Origen. And what's interesting is Clement is considered an Orthodox bishop by the later tradition, but he too emphasized heavily the notion of gnosis as a way to understand Christianity. That is, he, like other Gnostic Christians of this sort of region, would emphasize sort of higher knowledge as important to understanding the purpose of Christianity. One of the things that we'll see in future weeks is this was also a prominent locus for allegorical sort of exegesis of scriptural texts, right? So any text that was considered legitimate, you took this notion of gnosis and you read into the text the allegories that it was using to understand other issues. Here, Greek was a predominant imperial language, but Coptic quickly became important as a sort of hybrid of the Middle Egyptian that was spoken by colloquially with Greek sort of alphabetical emphasis. Mark is the disciple that is often sort of tied to this region, right? So just to recap, we have figures like Addai and Thomas and Bartholomew in Syria, Mesopotamia. You have John, especially popular in Greece and Asia Minor. You have Peter and Paul in these regions, and now you have the disciple Mark in Alexandria and Egypt into Nubia. The last place that we should discuss is that we had figures like Thomas who are said to have continued by being kidnapped and enslaved, to have brought Christianity as far as modern-day India, right? That we are told that Thomas is enslaved and, in fact, convinces the king through his sneaky ways to convert, right? And we'll talk more about this in future weeks, but we should note that this sort of sense of making it all the way to India, right, goes as far back as Alexander the Great, but continues to be popular not just to justify the Christian movement, but also in Apollonius of Tyana, who we read in our first week, is also said to have spread his message as far as India. Obviously, as you reach these areas, you spoke a lot of the local languages, right? And we find, for example, that the dominant Christian language that later sort of traditions around Thomas are preserved in Greek, but also in Syriac, right? Which is the sort of language that emerges out of Aramaic. So why does this matter? If we think about modern sort of traditions of around even how we sort of situate our day, right, where you live has a lot of importance, right? So some of the hotter ranges of this area, take, for example, Spain, practice a siesta, right? That it sounds very simplistic, right? But we've discussed how language and translation are not one-to-one correlations, but daily rhythms and access to water had deep influence, as we'll see in coming weeks, on how you understood how to be a good Christian. So we'll spend a bit of time in sections talking about how you'll create your own Google map, but this gives you a sense of why it's important to think about geography as a piece of understanding early Christian history.